First of all, Eric and I would like to thank the Ludwig von Mises Institute for allowing us the opportunity to present you today with the secessionist view of Quebec options. Unfortunately, we get the feeling most of the time in Quebec that you only hear one side of the story, namely, of course, the English-Canadian side of it. And when you hear about us in the media, usually it is something like, at its worst, Quebec nationalism is profoundly unsavory as a result of the resentful toxins of a decaying religious, linguistic, and racial world were pumped violently into the province's bloodstream. And then that goes on. There is far more anti-Semitism in Quebec than in English Canada. And then the bitter paradox for English Canadian is the knowledge that without their financial, legal, and moral support, the French language and the bitter strain of politics that grew up around it may well have died out. Now, this is taken from a small report in the New Republic, liberal magazine, that was published 2 years ago. Of course, this is utter nonsense, and once more, the New Republic was dead off the track, was the drawing off the track, but we keep reading reports similar to that in various publications in the United States. So, of course, we cannot undo all the damage that has been done to us in the last decades, but what we will try to do today is briefly to introduce you to a Quebec view of our national history. I will do that in less than 15 minutes. And Eric will then give you a more detailed account, a more detailed picture of what is actually going on in Quebec and what is likely to happen in the coming months. I've brought some maps with me. Okay, as you can all see, this is a map of North America, but it points out the French view of the early North American history. To put things briefly, the first French explorer who came to this part of the continent was Jacques Cartier in 1534. He landed somewhere around here in what is now the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec province. However, for many reasons, the French crown didn't pay any attention to the new territory. It was only 70 years later that another explorer, Samuel de Champlain, founded two settlements. One is what is now Nova Scotia, this area here. It was Port-Royal. This was the cradle of what is today Acadia, and the ancestors of our Cajun people in Louisiana come from that area. And in 1608, he founded another one, Quebec City, along the St. Lawrence River here, which proved over time to be much more significant. This is the cradle of the Quebecois, if you will. Eric and I are both Quebecois. Today, you have about 230,000 Acadians living in the maritime provinces of Canada, and roughly 5.5 million Quebecois living in Quebec and in the neighboring Ontario province. In time, the French colony was thus settled, if you will, in the early 17th century, and it lasted until 1760. In time, it became a thriving counter for the fur trade. At its peak, French expansion, of course, grew along the waterways of North America, namely the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes River System, and the Mississippi River System. The first map up here shows you the greatest expansion of the French colony. It ran at its peak from the Gulf of St. Lawrence all the way down to New Orleans. The French kept the territory by having various forts along the ways, namely Fort Duquesne, which became Pittsburgh, Fort Chartres, Detroit, which became Detroit, St. Louis, New Orleans, and other places. However, for many reasons, namely the harsh climate of the place, the exclusion of Huguenot immigration from Canada, and most of all, mercantilist policies from France that prevented the development of local industries. When the colony fell under British rule in 1760, you had only 60,000 inhabitants in it, as compared to well over 1.5 million in the 13 colonies. What happened following the conquest was that New France, which was all this area here, was shrunk to two tiny banks along the St. Lawrence River. And the French subjects were given two choices, either to stay and become British citizens or pack their bags and go back to France. Actually, what happened was that the elite left, the army officers, the most prominent merchants, and while the people who stayed were the rural settlers. Now to go quickly, then the British authority made a mistake. In order to keep us and to prevent the now growing secessionist tension in the United States, they greatly enlarged Quebec territory. So from the tiny piece of land along the St. Lawrence River, they expanded it to cover all the Great Lakes area and much significantly up north also. This, of course, infuriated the 13 colonies, and over time they seceded, and Quebec went back to a smaller portion of land over the Great Lake area here and along the St. Lawrence River. Now, following the conquest, following the U.S. secession, what happened was that a large movement of population occurred. There were a lot of tourists and Tories and loyalists to the British Crown who moved into Canada. So those people couldn't stand the idea of living under French civil law. So they were given their own territory, namely here in what became southern Ontario. As you can see here, what was the tiny portion of Quebec came back under, if you will, the majority of the population living in this area was French Canadian. So this gave rise to two conflicting views of the fate of the French-speaking population. On the one hand, you had people who thought that this was the first step toward a separate country. On the other, you had the most conservative segment of the population who thought that the French-speaking Canadians were better under British rule than under American rule, because otherwise, of course, we would be overwhelmed and assimilated quickly. And they also saw British rule as a kind of a buffer that would prevent the revolutionaries' idea that were really popular in France at the time. Now, to go quickly, what happened is that the French-speaking population was granted much more authority over time over governing its own affairs, but that there was always the possibility for the local British governor to veto these legislation. Over time, this became so frustrating that you had a rebellion in 1837 against British rule. To put this quickly, British army moved in, local leaders were either killed or sent to Australia, and for the first time in London, they explicitly stated policies saying that they wanted to assimilate the French-speaking population. So in 1840, you can see that the two colonies have merged, and for the first time in their history, French-Canadians were now a minority on their own ground. However, this union proved politically unworkable. There was no way French-Canadian politicians and English-Canadian politicians could get along, so a new deal had to be struck a generation later, in 1867. This was the British North America Act. As you can see, the British North America Act is a kind of the birth date, if you will, of modern Canada. Quebec has regained its own autonomy. Ontario has become Ontario. The maritime provinces are joined, with also British Columbia on the Pacific coast. There were many reasons behind that. First of all, there was a threat of U.S. aggression. You must remember that in 1867, when Canada was born, was also the year the U.S. bought Alaska, and that during the Civil War, the United Kingdom had sided with the South. So somehow there was also a lack of willingness in London to pay for the defense of the colony, and a lot of English Canadians fear another U.S. invasion. There was also the perceived need to build a link between British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, and the maritime provinces. Now, no private capitalist in its own mind would think of, building a railway system that would cover basically what were empty lands, inhospitable climate, and territories that offered no promise of development. They would rather, usually people in the West would either go by boat around, of course, to South America, or go by Minneapolis, Chicago, other places, and send their goods back to Montreal. So somehow the English Canadian, or at least politicians, came up with this idea that you needed a transcontinental railway link, and that of course taxpayer would finance it. So to put things briefly, following this British North America Act, things did not improve at all in Canada. In fact, things were so bad in economic terms that the people in the early 1870s in Quebec began migrating to New England. Now in 20 years, half of the French-speaking population of Canada had left for the United States to work in the mills in New England. Now, witnessing this, some politicians in Ottawa came up with what has since then been known in national policy of high tariffs and building more railways to unite the country together. The whole idea behind this, of course, would be that instead of being north-south, the flow of trades of goods and services would be east-west. Now, of course, over time, this didn't work out well at all. So in short, I guess we can say that Canada, as we know it today, was built on protectionism and this railway system that never made any sense. Now, quickly, what will then follows after that is the creation of the other Canadian provinces. As you can see, you've got Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and all the other provinces that are added to. So Quebec, at the beginning of the Confederation, was one, first among 4 and then among 5, and now it is one of 10 Canadian provinces. Now, in the Constitution, being a province carries many implications. I won't go into the details now, but just keep in mind that we moved from being 1 into 4 and 1 into 10. So this is another great issue right now in Quebec. You must also understand that over time, Canada moved from being a de jure British colony to being a de facto American economic colony. This can be shown, among other things, by the fact that after World War I, the level of investment in Canada that was of U.S. origins greatly overtook the level of British investment in it. There was also, after the Second World War, what came to be known as the Big Takeover. Namely, U.S. companies would come into Canada, engage in conglomerate building and so on. We don't have a word in French for the big takeover. It was never a big story for us, but for English Canadian, you've got a whole literature on this issue. To put the things really quickly again, what happened was that the people in Ottawa became much more political activists to try to go on with this kind of Canadian nation building. So they came up with, among other things, Trans-Canada Airlines, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, foreign investment review agencies, a regulatory agency that enforces Canadian content, quotas on our airwaves. We cannot watch the TV we want to. We've got an agency that decides, well, we've got to have that much Canadian television on the air and so on. All of this, again, in the name of nation building. However, the most favorite mode of intervention over time came to be fiscal policies and subsidies. At first, they were targeted towards specific industries, but over time, and what became much more preponderant, toward targeted region. The idea, of course, behind that was that Canada was a much more just society than the United States. That's the term that English Canadians usually use. And that if you want to stay in the Maritimes, work 3 months a year and get a welfare check for 9 months, well, that's okay. This is the Canadian way, and we can go on forever like that. Of course, all of this failed miserably, and Eric will give you a much more detailed picture of what is actually going on in Canada right now. Suffice it to say that this has been going on for well over 30 years, but that now recent studies have shown that regional discrepancies are much higher in Canada than in the United States, and that most than 80% of our external trade, of Canadian external trade, should I say, is still directed toward the United States. So clearly, all this nation building hasn't achieved much. Now, quickly, to understand what is actually going on in Quebec, you must understand that things have changed drastically in Quebec in the last 30 years. For one thing, the process that had been going on between Ottawa and Washington, it was repeated on a somewhat lower extent between Quebec City, the capital of the province of Quebec, where the majority of the French-speaking population live, and Ottawa. So, fearing and sort of the intrusion of Ottawa in all aspects of Quebec life, you had a bunch of technocrats in Quebec who came up with various rule regulation schemes, nationalization, and so on. So we're now stuck with two levels of stifling bureaucracies that are always cutting each other's throat. Of course, all of this at the expense of my generation, but that's another story. You must also understand that in the mid-60s, the secessionist movement in Quebec enjoyed a tremendous rebirth, if you will. There was one before, but I won't get into this. So in 1968, the Parti Québécois, the PQ, the official organ, if you will, of the secessionist movement, was born. It took power in 1976, but on the promise of being a good government and on holding a referendum on secession. They did in 1880, but then federal politicians came in, threatened people by a lot of them, and anyway, the secessionist vote lost. The secessionists only got 40% of the vote. The idea that I want to leave you with right now is that Canadian and Quebec history have shaped over time two conflicting loyalties. They are, of course, similar on some issues, but they are now clearly at odds on other. For one thing, all the politicians in Quebec are now strongly in favor of the liberalized trade, of the free trade between Canada and the U.S. The whole idea being, of course, that the natural north-south trade flow would take its own course and bring a much more needed prosperity right now. I would also like to point out that, contrary to what some liberal intellectual or intelligentsia seem to believe, there is no fascist or racist connotation to Quebec nationalism. It is simply a matter of, developing our culture and taking matters into our own hand. And I would finally like to point out that Canada, as we know it today, is a political creation, but also an economic and a geographic absurdity. But now Eric will put some numbers on that and brief you on what is actually going on in Quebec.
Okay, thank you. So, as Pierre said, I'll talk to you about the current situation. The current economic and political situation in Quebec as well as in Canada. As some of you probably know, year after year, the United Nations proclaim Canada as the best country of the world for its standard of living. Even Bill Clinton talks about Canada as an example for its quality of life, its low crime rate, and its generous social programs. And Hillary, of course, describes the Canadian Medicare system as the dream model where everything best is available and free for everyone. Unfortunately, the Canadian reality is not exactly the one described by Ms. Clinton. As Pierre said, Canada does not make sense economically. Canada was built by government's intervention rather than by people's will, and that's a big difference. It is now characterized by extraordinary levels of government intervention and by the lack of economic and commercial links between provinces. Canadians are now saddled with countless agencies on the federal and provincial levels, and nowhere is this more apparent than in Quebec. As a rule, the provincial agency is always trying to outdo its federal counterpart and vice versa. It has been estimated that if only 3 deduplications between Quebec City and Ottawa were ended, the savings would be in order of $3 billion annually. A huge sum, but insufficient to rally people towards secession. The most stunning result of all the federal and provincial interventions, however, is that Canada is now being proclaimed by the Wall Street Journal, and I quote, as an honorary member of the third world in the unmanageability of its debt problem. Canada has the second highest debt to GDP ratio of any industrialized country. The deficit is equivalent to 5.4% of Canada's GDP compared to about 2.6% in the United States. So those of you who think that you have a deficit problem, just think that it is more than 2 times bigger in Canada. Even worse, 44% of the Canadian debt is held by foreigners. Which, if you compare with Italy, who has more debt than Canada, then you can see that it's more than 4 times bigger than the Italian problem. 35% of all federal revenues now go to service the debt. So it means that for each dollar that we pay in tax and services in Canada, more than 1/3 of it is going to serve the interest on the debt. As you can see, it has been growing over the last 20 years. When the provincial debts, because provinces also have debts in Canada, when you add those debts with the federal one, the sum is even larger than the economy itself. It means that it's more than 100% of our GDP. That's data that are published by the Department of Finance in Canada. All levels of government in Canada now spend more than 51% of the GDP. If you compare over the last 15 years, it has grown by 13%. In the United States, it just grew up by 3%. So those of you, again, who think that the government is oversizing in the United States, just think that it's 4 times worse than Canada. Since 1979, real public expenditure per capita went up by 52%, and during this period, regulations have probably grown more rapidly than expenditures. Also, taxes in Canada are high, more than 37% to less than 30% in the United States, as you can see, and the gap between our 2 countries is still growing. The federal government levy close to half of them, which amounts to 33% more than all provincial governments combined, and this is the first reason why Ottawa is responsible for the high level of Canadian taxes. And the concrete result of that bad management of Canadian public finance by politicians and bureaucrats is our unemployment rate. During the 60s, the average unemployment rate was about 5%, in the 70s, 7%, in the 80s, more than 9%, and now in the 90s, it's more than 10%. Unfortunately, the data stopped in 93, because if 94 was added, it would be more than 11%. Elimination of the central government would thus be a major step toward a downsizing of political bureaucratic activism. In the Canadian context, secession would provide the only serious opportunity to get rid of the many coercive and costly institutions suffocating individual prosperity and liberty. In view of the current political system and national culture, there are simply no other alternatives. Let's take a closer look at Canada's international and internal trade. At least one would think Canadian economic integration brought some good with it. The reality is unfortunately not so clear. Consider some statistics about the movement of goods and services in the country. In 1989, the provinces traded $146 billion worth of goods and services with each other, while Canadians traded $160 billion with the rest of the world. So it means that the provinces in Canada are trading more with the rest of the world than with other provinces within their country. Although one might assume that this is proof of Canada's integration with the world economy, remember that more than 80% of this trade is directed toward the United States. But this does not show Canada's openness, but rather its geographical absurdity. It only proves that without political barriers, trade between, say, Vancouver and Seattle, or Toronto and the American Midwest, or Montreal and New York or Boston, trade would be greater.